I want you to picture a government building that feels less like architecture and more like judgment made concrete. Fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The air is procedural, polite, and suffocating. And in that room sits a man who once commanded the most dangerous project in human history. Robert Oppenheimer was not just a scientist. He was the coordinating mind behind the Manhattan Project, the intellectual conductor who aligned theoretical physics, military urgency, and industrial scale into one irreversible outcome. When the bomb worked, the world changed, and so did he. But now the applause is gone. He is not being celebrated. He is being evaluated. It's strange how quickly gravity shifts. Just a few years earlier, generals leaned toward him for guidance. Politicians sought his counsel. His voice carried strategic weight. Now, that same voice feels scrutinized, almost suspect. This isn't a story about equations. It's a story about authority. Because in Washington, authority is not owned. It is leased. And the lease can expire without warning. The question isn't how he built the bomb. The question is how the builder became the risk. What makes this reversal even more unsettling is how unlikely his rise once seemed. Oppenheimer was not the most decorated physicist of his generation. He had no Nobel Prize. He wasn't known for experimental mastery. In fact, some colleagues considered him too theoretical, too literary, too scattered to manage something as massive as Los Alamos. And yet, he became its center. At Los Alamos, something unusual happened. Rival egos aligned. Competing disciplines synchronized. Oppenheimer translated between minds the way a diplomat translates between nations. He could listen to a chemist, respond to a mathematician, and reassure a general all within the same hour. That was his real genius, not just physics, synthesis. He made complexity feel coherent. And coherence during wartime feels like salvation. But here's the hidden cost of becoming indispensable. Visibility. When you become the gravitational center, everyone feels your pull. Admirers gather close. Critics gather quietly. Power creates orbit. Orbit creates scrutiny. And scrutiny never fully disappears. It just waits for the climate to change. After the war, Oppenheimer didn't retreat into quiet academia. He stepped directly into policy debates. He became a public intellectual voice in atomic strategy, advising on how this new destructive power should be governed. And here's where the tone shifted. When discussions turned toward the hydrogen bomb, something far more destructive than Hiroshima, Oppenheimer urged caution, not surrender. Not pacifism, caution. He questioned speed. He questioned inevitability. He questioned whether building something because it was possible meant it was necessary. Inside a rapidly hardening Cold War environment, that distinction mattered. The political atmosphere was no longer experimental. It was defensive. The Soviet Union had detonated its own atomic bomb. Fear compressed timelines. Urgency replaced reflection. In rooms where acceleration felt patriotic, hesitation felt dangerous. Suddenly, Oppenheimer's intellectual nuance didn't read as wisdom. It read as obstruction. And once doubt attaches to your judgment, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads outward into motives, into associations, into history. The crack in the image wasn't dramatic. It was tonal. And tonal shifts in power structures often precede structural collapse. Now we enter the most uncomfortable part of the story. Oppenheimer had past associations in the 1930s with individuals linked to communist organizations. This was not secret. Many academics of that era flirted with left-leaning causes during the Great Depression. The context was economic collapse and anti-fascist solidarity, but context evaporates under pressure. By the early 1950s, America was deep inside the Red Scare. Loyalty wasn't assumed, it was audited. Associations weren't interpreted, they were categorized. Files reopened. Conversations resurfaced. Old friendships were reframed through a new lens. Here's the critical shift. He was not accused of espionage. No evidence suggested he passed secrets. The concern centered on judgment and reliability. Those words sound administrative. They are anything but. In high-security systems, reliability is oxygen. If doubt contaminates that oxygen even slightly, the system reacts, and the more visible you are, the more oxygen you consume. Suspicion gained momentum not because of a single explosive revelation, but because ambiguity became intolerable. And ambiguity was Oppenheimer's natural habitat. By 1954, the tension crystallized into a formal security hearing, not a criminal trial, not a public spectacle, a closed-room evaluation of whether J. Robert Oppenheimer should retain access to classified material. But make no mistake, security clearance in that era was synonymous with influence. Without it, you were intellectually disarmed. Testimony unfolded over weeks. Colleagues spoke. Some defended his patriotism passionately. Others questioned his consistency. A few recalibrated their distance in subtle ways that revealed how fragile alliances become under institutional pressure. The room didn't feel chaotic. It felt procedural. And that's what made it more chilling, because procedural systems can dismantle reputations without raising their voice. When the decision came, it was administrative clearance revoked. Officially, he remained a distinguished physicist. Unofficially, he was removed from the core strategic circle that defined nuclear policy. To the public, it looked sudden. But inside that room, the silence had been building for years. And the most powerful thing about silence? It never announces itself before it does its damage. If Chapter 1 was about atmosphere, this chapter is about mechanics. The 1954 security hearing was not framed as punishment. It was framed as evaluation. That distinction matters. No judge in robes, no jury, no dramatic public cross-examinations. Instead, a panel tasked with determining whether Oppenheimer was a security risk. Notice the phrasing: not disloyal, not criminal, a risk. And risk in Cold War America had a mathematical simplicity. If there is even a small probability of compromise, remove the variable. The hearing dissected decades-old interactions. Conversations from the 1930s were examined with 1950s suspicion. Donations to causes, social circles, faculty associations. Every connection became a data point. But this wasn't about discovering new facts. It was about reinterpreting old ones. The Cold War compressed ambiguity. It demanded clarity in places where history had left blur. The more layered your past, the more vulnerable you were to reframing. Oppenheimer's intellectual subtlety, once admired, now looked evasive under interrogation. And when a system decides it needs reassurance, it doesn't ask, "Are you innocent?" It asks, "Are you safe enough?" Then came the testimonies. Some of the most brilliant scientific minds of the era entered that quiet chamber. They weren't there to debate quantum theory. They were there to weigh a colleague's character. Several defended him firmly. They described his patriotism, his commitment during the war, his tireless leadership at Los Alamos. They emphasized that no evidence suggested espionage, but others introduced hesitation. A few questioned his judgment regarding past associations. Some implied he was unpredictable. One particularly influential voice suggested that while Oppenheimer was loyal, his influence might not be aligned with national priorities. Listen carefully to that shift. Loyal, but inconvenient. In rooms like that, tone carries more force than accusation. You could sense the survival instinct operating beneath the surface. The Cold War wasn't just testing Oppenheimer, it was testing everyone's proximity to him. Support him too strongly, and you risk inherited suspicion. Distance yourself, and you protect your own standing. It wasn't betrayal in the cinematic sense, it was atmospheric pressure, and pressure reveals fracture lines you didn't know were there. Here's the moment that feels almost absurd in hindsight. The central issue that gained traction was not espionage, it was not secret transfers, it was not proven sabotage, it was hesitation. Years earlier, Oppenheimer had been approached by a colleague with communist ties who suggested sharing scientific information with the Soviet Union. Oppenheimer did not report the approach immediately. He later disclosed it, but the delay became the fracture point. In a calmer era, that might have been interpreted as human confusion. In 1954, it was interpreted as compromised judgment. The logic was chillingly simple. If he hesitated once, could he hesitate again? If he misjudged a situation before, could he misjudge one under greater pressure? The standard wasn't criminal guilt, it was flawless foresight, and no human being can meet that standard indefinitely. This is the impossible moment of the story. Not because he was proven dangerous, but because the bar for trust had shifted from loyalty to perfection. And perfection is a moving target in a climate of fear. Observers later described Oppenheimer during the hearing as composed, analytical, yet visibly strained. He answered questions precisely, sometimes too precisely. He tried to explain nuance in a system that no longer tolerated it. When asked about his past associations, he contextualized them historically. When asked about policy disagreements, he framed them philosophically. He believed intellectual clarity could restore trust. But the more he clarified, the more complicated he appeared. Brilliance can feel destabilizing when institutions crave simplicity. His intellect, once celebrated for navigating complexity, now looked like something that required management. Instead of being the strategic asset guiding nuclear policy, he was framed as a potential variable in an equation of national survival. It wasn't that he lacked intelligence, it was that his intelligence no longer aligned with institutional mood. And alignment, not brilliance, determines who remains inside the circle. You could almost feel the gravitational shift happening in real time. When the decision finally arrived, it was delivered in administrative language. His security clearance would not be renewed. That was it. No dramatic condemnation. No declaration of treason. Just a bureaucratic conclusion that he was not sufficiently reliable for continued access to classified information. But in Washington, clearance is currency. Without it, you are intellectually fenced off from the most consequential conversations. You can advise in theory, but you cannot shape in practice. The architect of the atomic bomb was now excluded from the strategic core of nuclear policy. To the outside world, this felt like a sudden collapse. Headlines simplified the narrative. Hero fallen, genius disgraced. Inside the system, however, it was framed as risk management. And here's the quiet devastation. He was still respected, still admired in academic circles, still brilliant, but proximity to power had vanished, and in political ecosystems, influence doesn't survive distance. Somewhere in the aftermath of that decision, another choice hovered over his desk. A letter. One that might have changed the tone of his exit. But he never sent it. After the verdict, something quieter began to circulate in historical recollections. Not a speech. Not a public denunciation. A draft. Accounts suggest Oppenheimer considered resigning before the hearing concluded, possibly even before the final ruling was announced. A letter of protest. A refusal to validate a process he may have believed was structurally tilted. But the letter was never sent. And that absence carries weight. Because in high-stakes environments, silence is rarely neutral. It can signal strategy. It can signal calculation. It can signal exhaustion. Imagine the tension of that moment. If he resigned publicly, he could frame the narrative, a principled stand against paranoia. If he stayed, he preserved a narrow corridor of institutional presence, even without clearance. The unsent letter sits at the center of this chapter not as a physical artifact, but as a psychological hinge. It represents the fork in the road between moral theater and strategic endurance. And sometimes the choice not to act is the most revealing action of all. Let's explore the alternative. If Oppenheimer had resigned in protest before the ruling, he might have ignited public debate. He might have framed himself as a casualty of Cold War excess. The narrative could have shifted from security risk to principled dissenter. But there's another possibility. In the political climate of 1954, dramatic defiance might not have been interpreted as courage. It might have been framed as confirmation of instability. Protest, in a fearful system, can be misread as defiance against the state itself. Oppenheimer understood institutions. He knew how power metabolizes dissent. By remaining in place, by not sending the letter, he avoided escalating the confrontation. He absorbed the institutional blow without amplifying the spectacle. That choice complicates the mythology. We prefer heroes who slam doors. We admire visible rebellion. But long-term influence sometimes requires staying seated when standing would feel more satisfying. Courage is contextual. And in this case, the courage may have been restraint. But restraint has a cost. It rarely produces applause. After the hearing, Oppenheimer did not disappear from intellectual life. He remained director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Scholars continued to visit. Students continued to listen. His mind did not dim. But the architecture around him changed. During the war and its immediate aftermath, he stood inside the national command structure. He advised presidents. He shaped nuclear doctrine. His thoughts influenced deterrence policy at the highest levels. After 1954, that proximity evaporated. He could think, he could speak, he could publish, but he could no longer steer. There's a profound psychological shift that occurs when expertise loses direct access to power. You remain brilliant, yet structurally peripheral. And humans are sensitive to that distinction. Observers noted a change in tone, less policy engagement, more philosophical reflection. He turned inward, intellectually and emotionally. The clearance revocation did not erase his achievements. It reclassified his influence. He moved from architect to commentator, and that demotion, though subtle, reshaped how history would remember him. As years passed, the narrative began to simplify. To some, Oppenheimer became a martyr and intellectual, punished for conscience. To others, he became a cautionary example of compromised judgment. Both versions are tidy, neither is complete. The real Oppenheimer lived in tension. He helped build the most destructive weapon in history. He later questioned the acceleration of even greater destructive force. He navigated political landscapes imperfectly. He made decisions that were strategic, emotional, and sometimes inconsistent. Myth prefers clarity. Reality prefers contradiction. The unsent letter became symbolic because it invites projection. If you see him as heroic, the silence was dignified endurance. If you see him as flawed, the silence was hesitation. History compresses nuance into archetype. But when we zoom in closely, what we find is not a flawless genius or a reckless liability. We find a human navigating institutional turbulence with incomplete information, and that human complexity resists cinematic simplification, which is precisely why the letter matters. Step back from the individual for a moment. The Manhattan Project required unprecedented secrecy, speed, and coordination. It built a new kind of security apparatus, one optimized for wartime urgency. After the war, that apparatus did not dissolve, it evolved. The Cold War hardened the system, loyalty metrics tightened, risk tolerance shrank. The structure that once empowered Oppenheimer now recalibrated around deterrence, expansion, and ideological certainty. And here's the irony. He helped construct the very institutional machinery that would later exclude him. Systems are not sentimental. They optimize for current conditions. During World War II, his intellectual agility was an asset. During the Red Scare, that same agility appeared unstable. The unsent letter was not just about pride or protest. It reflected an awareness that the system had moved beyond him. When institutions evolve, individuals must either adapt or become misaligned. Oppenheimer did not fully align. And when misalignment becomes visible, even architects can be redesigned out of their own creation. Which brings us to the deeper question. Was this tragedy personal or structural? There's a strange tax placed on people who think ahead of their time. During World War II, Oppenheimer's ability to anticipate complexity made him invaluable. He could see several moves ahead, intellectually mapping consequences before others articulated them. In wartime, that foresight felt heroic. But in the early Cold War, foresight became friction. When he urged caution about the hydrogen bomb, he wasn't arguing for weakness. He was questioning acceleration. He wanted deliberation before escalation. Strategically, he feared a thermonuclear arms race would destabilize global equilibrium. Yet timing is everything. In 1954, national mood favored speed and superiority. The Soviet Union was no longer theoretical. It was nuclear. Political leaders did not want philosophers. They wanted certainty. Being early can resemble being resistant. And when urgency dominates policy, the person advocating pause appears misaligned. The tragedy isn't that he was necessarily wrong or right. It's that correctness is irrelevant if the clock runs faster than your argument. Genius, without temporal alignment, becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability, in a fear-driven system, is reclassified as risk. The Cold War reduced identity into clean categories, loyal or suspect, patriot or sympathizer, inside or outside. Binary systems feel efficient. They simplify decisions. They reduce cognitive load. But they also erase nuance. Oppenheimer was not a binary thinker. His intellectual style thrived in gradients. He understood that moral, scientific, and political decisions exist along spectra, That very capacity for layered reasoning made him powerful in 1943. By 1954, it made him ambiguous. And ambiguity is intolerable in systems under stress. He had past associations with left-leaning individuals. He had supported anti-fascist causes during the Depression. None of that equaled espionage, but it refused clean categorization. In a binary environment, refusal to fit the mold triggers alarms. Here's the deeper insight. Loyalty is not only about belief, it's about signaling. Clear signals reduce anxiety. Complex signals increase it. Oppenheimer signaled complexity. The system demanded clarity. When complexity meets binary judgment, complexity usually loses, not because it lacks merit, but because it resists compression. Now let's zoom into something more subtle, how humans process authority. In learning psychology, we rely heavily on status cues. Titles, access, proximity to power. These markers shape how we evaluate credibility. When someone holds a position inside the core of decision-making, we unconsciously amplify their authority. When that position disappears, perception shifts instantly. After his clearance was revoked, Oppenheimer remained the same intellect. His knowledge did not evaporate, his insights did not degrade, but his badge did. And that single institutional change recalibrated how policymakers perceived him. Students at Princeton still saw brilliance. Scientists still saw depth. But government officials saw distance. Our brains simplify social hierarchies rapidly. If the institution withdraws endorsement, cognitive framing adjusts. This is not cynicism, it's human psychology. Authority is co-constructed between individual and system. Remove the system's visible backing, and even a genius appears diminished. Oppenheimer's fall reveals how fragile intellectual authority becomes when institutional scaffolding is removed. And once that scaffolding collapses, rebuilding status is exponentially harder than building it the first time. Years later, in 1963, Oppenheimer received the Enrico Fermi Award. It was a significant honor presented by the U.S. government itself. For many, it felt like partial redemption, recognition, respect, a gesture that the nation acknowledged his contributions. But awards operate differently from authority. An award reframes the past. It does not restore structural power. By the time of this recognition, nuclear strategy had evolved without him at its center. New advisors had filled the vacuum. Policy machinery had moved on. The honor was meaningful. It was sincere, but it did not return him to the inner strategic circle. This is the quiet complexity of reputational repair. Institutions can apologize symbolically while preserving structural decisions. Oppenheimer's public standing improved. His historical stature stabilized. But his influence over nuclear doctrine never fully regained wartime amplitude. Reversal in narrative does not equal reversal in access, and sometimes redemption arrives too late to alter trajectory, which leaves us with the most intriguing fork in the story. Let's return to that unsent letter. Imagine he had resigned in protest before the hearing concluded. Imagine he had publicly framed the process as fear-driven overreach. What would have happened? One possibility, he becomes a moral icon immediately, a symbol of intellectual independence against political paranoia. Another possibility, he accelerates his own marginalization. The system interprets protest as instability. His access evaporates even faster. Public opinion shaped by Cold War anxiety turns harsher. Counterfactuals reveal system mechanics. They force us to ask, does defiance strengthen legacy? Or does it sacrifice influence for purity? There is no definitive answer. That's why the letter remains powerful. It represents a gamble never taken. Bold exits can create myth. They can also close doors permanently. By not sending the letter, Oppenheimer preserved a sliver of institutional belonging, even after clearance loss. But he also surrendered control over the narrative of his fall. And that tension defines the final chapter of this story. Because what vanished overnight was not his intellect. It was his position inside the machinery of power. From the outside, it looks instantaneous. April 1954. Clearance revoked. Career collapsed. That's the headline version. Clean, cinematic, sudden. But careers at that altitude rarely vanish in a single stroke. They erode first. Access narrows quietly. Invitations shift in tone. Conversations happen without you. The gravitational center drifts inches at a time until one day you realize you are no longer standing where you used to stand. Oppenheimer's influence had already begun thinning before the verdict. His opposition to rapid hydrogen bomb development placed him at odds with accelerating policy currents. His intellectual caution felt increasingly inconvenient inside rooms demanding decisive escalation. By the time the ruling arrived, the infrastructure of trust had already weakened. The overnight narrative comforts us because it simplifies causality. It allows us to believe that one decision caused everything. But structural change rarely announces itself dramatically. It accumulates, and when the formal decision finally lands, it feels like a collapse. In reality, it's a confirmation. What vanished overnight was visibility. What had been fading for years was proximity. We love the idea that genius exists above politics, that if someone is brilliant enough, their insight will shield them from institutional volatility. That intellect creates immunity. Oppenheimer's story dismantles that myth. Brilliance amplifies visibility. Visibility invites scrutiny. Scrutiny, under fear, mutates into suspicion. He was not removed because he lacked intelligence. He was removed because intelligence alone does not guarantee alignment with prevailing incentives. Institutions operate on stability, predictability, and signal clarity. When a mind introduces complexity during moments demanding certainty, that mind can be reclassified as disruptive. This is uncomfortable because it challenges our meritocratic instinct. We want to believe systems reward ability consistently, but systems reward alignment first. Talent is valuable. Predictability is safer. The myth of the untouchable genius collapses under pressure. Oppenheimer's intellect survived. His status did not. And that distinction is the key to understanding modern power structures just as much as Cold War ones. History often narrates events through personalities. Heroes rise, villains obstruct, individuals clash. But zoom out. The Cold War security apparatus was built to minimize uncertainty. Its incentive structure favored decisive loyalty signals and rapid technological advancement. Within that framework, Oppenheimer's cautious posture on thermonuclear escalation created friction. It wasn't personal animosity alone. It was systemic incompatibility. When systems evolve, they optimize around new variables. The Manhattan Project valued interdisciplinary creativity. The early Cold War valued strategic conformity. Oppenheimer fit the first environment perfectly. He misaligned with the second. This reframing shifts blame away from simplistic character judgments. It doesn't absolve individuals of decisions, but it highlights incentive design. If you want to understand why careers vanish, don't just study the person. Study the system they're standing inside. Because when the system updates its operating logic, even its architects can become outdated code, and outdated code gets deprecated quietly. Now, the story turns toward us. The unsent letter is not just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror. When do you speak up? When do you absorb pressure strategically? When does protest strengthen your long-term influence? When does it end it? Oppenheimer stood at that intersection. Send the letter, and he could control the narrative of defiance. Don't send it, and he preserves institutional connection, however weakened. Every ambitious thinker eventually faces a version of this dilemma. Loyalty versus dissent. Influence versus purity. Timing versus conviction. We often romanticize bold exits, but exits come with trade-offs. Silence can be weakness. Silence can also be calculation. The letter stayed in the drawer. History moved forward. And that quiet decision forces a deeper realization. Power is not only about intelligence or morality. It's about strategic positioning inside evolving systems, which means the lesson of this story is not about 1954 alone. It's about every room where authority is negotiated today. So did his career truly vanish? Not exactly. His scientific contributions endure. His leadership at Los Alamos remains foundational. His later philosophical reflections continue shaping how we discuss science and responsibility. But his central role in national nuclear strategy ended in that hearing room. His legacy fractured into layers. Architect of the bomb, critic of escalation, victim of Cold War suspicion, complex strategist navigating impossible choices. Legacy is not decided in a single moment. It is negotiated across decades. Awards later softened the narrative. Historians revisited the fairness of the hearing. Public memory evolved. But the structural shift of 1954 never fully reversed. What vanished overnight was not brilliance. It was belonging inside the machinery of power. And perhaps that is the final insight. Genius can change the world, but belonging determines whether you're allowed to keep shaping it. The letter he didn't send reminds us that sometimes history turns not on explosions, but on silence.